All rise. Veuillez vous lever. The International Criminal Court is now in session. L'audience de la Cour pénale internationale est ouverte. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Good morning, everyone. Court officer, please call the case.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. Situation in the Central African Republic 2, in the case of the prosecutor versus Alfred Yekatom and Patrice Edouard Ngai ssona, case reference ICC 0114-0118, and for the record, we are in open session.
Thank you very much. I ask for the appearance of the parties. First, the prosecution, Mr. van der Poel. Now, today I'm right that you are speaking.
Yes, Mr. President. Good morning to you. Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning, everyone. Today, the prosecution is represented by Lucio Garcia, Maria Berdenikova, Manuchitra Pravdaban, Yassin Mosfa, Sylvie Wakchum, Leila Axius, and myself, Kweko Van.
Thank you very much. I turn to Ms. Tuzima, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. The team of the legal representatives for the other crimes is made up of Orchelon Nyaratsetse, Enrique Carnero, Alexis Darivière, Evelyne Evini, and myself, Edith Duzima. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Tuzima. Mr. Seppo, next.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honors. The formal child soldiers are represented today by Amina Merouche and myself, Dmitro Sopron. Thank you.
Thank you. I turn to the defense. First, the defense, like always, of Mr. Yekatom.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honors. Good morning, everyone. Mr. Yekatom is present in the courtroom, and he's represented today by Ms. Sabrine Bessa, Ms. Alexandra Baer, Ms. Anta Guissé, Ms. Sarah Bafadel, Mr. Florent Pages-Granier, Ms. Yusra Lamkadam, Mr. Guillaume Suzuki, Ms. Léa Benoit, Mr. Amaury Mandosé, Ms. Curé, Roman Curé, and Ms. Evelise Ngakusam, and myself, Milan Dimitri.
Thank you. That was already not an easy task, actually. Now the defense of Mr. Ngai ssona, please. Ms. Prou.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. Good morning, everyone. During this first session, the Ngai ssona defense is represented by Sarah Pedroso, Despina Eleftherio, Lou Van Crignon, Melissa Beaulieu-Lucier, and Alexandre de Sevdavi, and myself, Marie-Hélène Prou. But there will be a change in composition for the second session.
And you will tell us then.
Yes.
And to pick that up, actually, we also, as a chamber, pick up the suggestion by the defense teams to have only two sessions, two 2-hour sessions that can be accommodated. So this means we have now a 2-hour session, let's say, roughly until 11:30. Perhaps close to 11. When it suits you, we have a 5-minute break, have to have for the interpreters, have been told. We have to do that, really short break. And then we have a shortened lunch break, and we envision to start with the second defense team at 12:30. I think that's fine with everyone. So I give now Ms. Dimitri the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Honors, I will never say it often enough. It's a privilege to appear before you, and it has been a privilege to work with this defense team. Today, you will hear me, followed by Ms. Bessat, and then Mr. Pages-Granier, and then I will take the floor one last time to conclude our oral submissions on sentencing. And as my prosecutor counterpart stated yesterday, it's the first time that the court hears submissions prior to an Article 74 judgment. But unlike the prosecution, we will not rehash or reopen substantive issues concerning the main case with tenuous links on sentencing. Instead, we will focus on limiting our submissions that we hope will assist Your Honors in any sentencing. And when an accused stands before the international court, his credibility is frequently diminished, if not entirely absent from the outset. And so it's especially important to reset when it comes to sentencing, particularly prior to an Article 74 judgment. And more so when all three speakers yesterday sought to diminish Mr. Yekatom's intention, his credibility, and his objectives at the time of the event and after the event. And even yesterday, at this stage of proceedings, prior to an Article 74 judgment, Mr. Yekatom's presumption of innocence was treated with disregard. Both the prosecution and the victim's representative want you to find against him his apparent lack of remorse for crimes, notwithstanding his treatment and empathy towards the Muslim population and victims during the events, and his apparent lack of remorse for crimes that have not been found against him, including crimes we strongly assert have been fabricated. Today, you will hear Ms. Baysat, who will delve into the character of Mr. Yekatom, who he was, and the values he upheld. You will also hear her addressing mitigating factors and the evidence which seems to escape the prosecution and victims in their submissions. Mr. Pagès-Granier will then discuss the person Mr. Yekatom has become after 6 years in detention. And we respectfully urge Your Honors to approach their description of Mr. Yekatom with the credibility he deserves in its full context. And this context also includes his approach to these proceedings. It was his intention to oppose every delay or postponement of these proceedings. And we strived to ensure that justice was neither delayed nor compromised, guided by Mr. Yekatom's desire, including by fostering cooperation with the prosecution or victims whenever it was possible during these proceedings. And when the prosecution encountered challenges with witnesses' availability, we provided constructive alternatives, ensuring that proceedings would remain on track, as Mr. Yekatom expressed readiness and willingness to engage productively in these proceedings. And even when addressing bureaucratic challenges at the detention center, where Mr. Yekatom's cultural rights were at stake, he adhered to established mechanism with courtesy and persistence. And however, as Mr. Pagès-Granier will explain, even after obtaining a presidency decision that recognized Mr. Yekatom's rights and that highlighted the registry's non-compliance, the registry failed to act and implement it. And the indifference of the registry to the defense request must also be considered, particularly in the context of the allegation of evidence fabrication. You heard counsel for representing the alleged former child soldier yesterday, requesting 20 years on behalf of his 292 clients. And given that he speaks and spoke on behalf of his 292 clients and describe their alleged harm and suffering under the person they somehow describe in his brief and in his sentencing submission as their commander, I cannot stay silent on the issue of fabrication of evidence, even during today's sentencing submission. When we requested the registry to conduct an internal investigation into this matter of involvement of registry contracted individuals in relation to fabrication of evidence, the registry rejected our claim, wrongly asserting that the interactions of certain court-affiliated individuals fell within the scope of the litigation before your honors. This assertion was misplaced. Such a position does not preclude the registry from exercising its administrative mandate to apply internal instructions on unsatisfactory behavior and unsatisfactory conduct, and to initiate an investigation into its contracted intermediaries. But yet, the registry refused to act. And I raise this now during the submissions on sentencing because they are pertinent to the onerous circumstances faced by Mr. Yekatom in these proceedings, and the manner in which he has approached such onerous circumstances. And allow me to ask your honors to place yourself in my position. The prosecution ultimately acknowledged the evidence fabrication uncovered by the defense. And despite the gravity of these revelations, the registry continued to contract individuals implicated in Article 70 investigations. And after we explained to Mr. Yekatom everything we have done, all the motions we have filed, all the requests we had produced and submitted in relation to the fabrication of evidence, he asked me a number of questions. And I'm unable to answer Mr. Yekatom when he asks me how many victims' forms these intermediaries assisted in completing. I'm equally unable to answer him when he asks me whether these intermediaries remain contracted by OPCV or VPRS, both registries' organs. And what can I say when he's asking me whether family members of these offenders are still participating victims and are part of those victims who requested yesterday 20 years of imprisonment? So today, I ask your honors to factor these procedure violations into your consideration as to how it impacted Mr. Yekatom's time and resources to present his defense and to prepare his defense, because it's a fundamental right recognized by the statute. Imagine how much time we spent, how much resource we spent investigating alone on the fraudulent actions of those intermediaries acting on behalf of the registry's organs. And today, we stand before you not seeking favor, but fairness for Mr. Yekatom. And we ask that your honors take into account Mr. Yekatom's conduct during the events, after the events, and including his conduct during these proceedings. And in a moment, my colleagues will address how, despite the frustrations arising from the registry's inaction, Mr. Yekatom respected the rules imposed upon him. Mr. Yekatom's goal has always been to place his trust in the justice process and never to obstruct it. And in contrast, the prosecution tried to paint the picture yesterday of someone who deserves no credit at all. The prosecution has undertaken an unreasonable approach, including in relation to its proposed sentence of 22 years. And after Ms. Bessat and Mr. Pages-Cranier will address your honors, I will establish how the prosecution has failed to substantiate this sentence, and in particular, in comparison with other sentences both imposed by this court and requested by the prosecution's office itself in other cases before this court. And I will now leave the floor to Ms. Bessat.
Thank you, Ms. Bessat.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
Messieurs les juges,
Your Honors,
le 9 juillet 2020,
on 9 July
Yekatom apparaissait pour
2020,
la première fois devant
Mr.
votre
Yekatom appeared for the first
chambre. Il y a
time
maintenant plus de
before
4
your
ans.
chamber more than 4 years
Depuis cette
ago.
première audience de mise en état,
From that
tout
first
le long de son procès,
status conference and throughout this trial,
Monsieur Yekatom
you have
assis
seen
dans cette
Mr.
salle d'audience.
Yekatom seated in
Vous
this
avez
courtroom on a daily
les témoins,
basis.
les uns après les
You
autres,
have heard
vous parler de Monsieur
testimonies
Yekatom.
after testimony
Et ces derniers jours,
talk to you about
vous avez
Mr.
entendu
Yekatom. In
Monsieur
these
le
last
procureur
few days, you
et
heard the
représentant des
prosecutor
victimes
and the legal
dresser un
representatives
portrait
of
erroné
victims
et
give
déraisonnable
you
de Monsieur
a
Yekatom.
false and unreasonable picture
Disant
of
notamment,
Mr.
et je
Yekatom
cite,
when they tell
La
you
réputation
that,
violente
and I
de
quote,
Monsieur Yekatom était reconnue
Mr.
et fondée.
Yekatom's violent reputation was recognized and well-founded. I want to remedy this situation by showing you who Mr. Yekatom truly is. You see, it is easy to talk about accused persons in international trials in a certain way, but it is also important to understand how to talk and deal with the personality of Mr. Yekatom in this case. Mr. President, Your Honors, I would like first of all to talk to you about Mr. Yekatom's life. Mr. Yekatom was born on the 23rd of January 1973 in Catin in Bangui. He comes from a modest family. His father was a bank worker and his mother was a housewife who sold small merchants on a stall at the market. The Central African tradition sometimes requires that Mr. Yekatom would take on the names of two of his uncles, Mokpem Rambon being the first and Evariste Yekatom being the second, as also a member of his family. Mr. Yekatom grew up in Catin. He attended school till the 4th year of secondary school. Unfortunately, his education was interrupted several times because of the several political crises that the Central African Republic experienced. Mr. Yekatom grew up within a community of his Muslim brothers throughout his childhood and even into his adult life, as was stated by D298023, as you can see on the screen. During his childhood, Mr. Yekatom loved to play football. He played at the Sakbatu field. It is located in the PK5 arrondissement, in the 3rd arrondissement in Bangui. He played on this football pitch with his young friends from various neighborhoods and various faith groups. And that is how he got to meet witness P1317, otherwise known as Ibrahim. When his father died, unfortunately, Mr. Yekatom, being the eldest of his siblings, had to definitely drop out of school and start work. He started to sell small goods in PK5 neighborhood, particularly shoes. After a number of years, with a view to improving the financial situation of his family, he decided to go to Brazzaville, a town which he chose because of its proximity in order to remain close to his family. Even in that new country which was not his, Mr. Yekatom continued to do trading, and he sacrificed 8 years of his life for his family. He is a courageous person who likes to work, as described by his friends and his close persons. I refer to D298023 and D298024, who describe him, as you can see on the screen, as a generous person who was close to the underprivileged. It is particularly said, as you can see on the screen, that Mr. Yekatom provided assistance to the population of his neighborhood at funerals and for improving the conditions of living. After spending 8 years in Brazzaville, Mr. Yekatom decided to return to Brazzaville, where he continued to do trading with his friend, witness D298023. In 2003, Mr. Yekatom joined the Liberators Movement under President Bozizé with a view to overthrowing President Patasse, who was then in power. He then undertook military training in the regular army in 2004 in Boa, in the east of the Central African Republic. Following that military training, Mr. Yekatom joined the Republican Guard Provincial Battalion at an entry level. Throughout his military career, he was promoted 3 times, as you can see on the screen. He rose to the modest rank of Chief Corporal, and he rose through the ranks without any favoritism, contrary to what happens in the military in the Central African Republic. During his career in 2008, he was transferred to the 3rd Bureau, B3 of the General Staff, and worked in the archives under Captain Gremangu. Mr. Yekatom, as you know, remained in service as a soldier till 2016 when he was elected Member of Parliament in the National Assembly in his constituency. It is still in the northeast of the Central African Republic that Mr. Yekatom met his former wife, D298025, whose name is Aisha. She is Muslim, and with whom he had a daughter who is also a Muslim. D298024 statement was submitted to you, and it describes to you how respectful Mr. Yekatom had always been of the wife's religion. You can see the description on the screen, and I would like to refer you to part of that statement, paragraph 15, and I quote, "At the time, Rambo was a soldier, and we got to know each other when he was out with some friends. We became friends. I had always worn my veil. He knew that I was a Muslim. I did my 5 prayers a day. When I was dating him, I would go pray, and he respected that. And religion had never been a problem when we were dating." Now, Mr. Yekatom then introduced Aisha to his friends, particularly D292023, and to his family, and Aisha also introduced Mr. Yekatom to her family, particularly her brother, 2298026, who generally testified about how respectful Mr. Yekatom was of Islam and Muslims. You can see on the screen that he testified that I always considered that he respected me and he respected Muslims in general. For example, when he came to visit me and I was praying, he would wait in a corner until I finished. I also knew that he respected my sister's religious practices because she always wore her veil and he never forbade her from doing so. In spite of the distances separating them, Mr. Yekatom has maintained contact by telephone, has met the needs of the daughter, and connected with her on phone while she's in Cameroon. And while he was in detention, his daughter came to visit him last year, 2023. And one of the things Mr. Yekatom thinks is important is that her daughter should continue to practice her faith or her religion.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Your Honors, I would like now to expand on Mr. Yekatom's family and the impact of his detention on Mr. Yekatom and on his family. To be clear, Mr. President, I would like to talk to you about the impact on his detention, on himself, that is on Mr. Yekatom, so that you understand who he really is. And Mr. Bajes Grenier, my learned colleague, will also subsequently talk to you about the breaches of his rights in detention. The explanation we provide about this impact on his detention will enable you to understand who Mr. Yekatom is. You see, before he was accused, before this court, he is a son, a father, a husband, a father, a grandfather, who is very involved in the lives of his family, of his children. But before I proceed, Mr. President, on the impact of Mr. Yekatom's detention, let me open a small parenthesis and revisit the statements that were made in this courtroom last December by the legal representatives of victims, and I quote, "We have heard the accused complain about the detention conditions, arguing that his culture and food were not taken into account and that he didn't receive visits from his close relatives. These statements have caused harm to the victims, who have hoped that these matters will be settled, particularly given that the living conditions are covered by the court." I want to make it very clear that it is very important for Mr. Yekatom that we do not in any way question the horrible suffering of the victims of the incidents of 2012-2013. It is very important for their concerns to be taken into account. But as you know, it is not the purpose of the judicial system to impose punishment on the victims based on the suffering of the victims. In fact, the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth rule cannot be upheld, but only the relevant international rules, and in this regard, the respect to the victims must also be upheld. That is why today I and Maître Grenier will address a number of issues around the life of Mr. Yekatom in detention, because there was a lack of attention to the cultural aspects of Mr. Yekatom's detention. You see, this is an international court which deals particularly with people from all over the world who come to a European territory, and this aspect should not be neglected. The defense team believes that these rights should be defended and any violation should be taken into account. Having said this, Mr. President, Your Honors, I want to close this parenthesis and address Mr. Yekatom's family situation. Mr. Yekatom has 14 children whom he had with various wives. 8 of them are minor. 2 of them have lost their mothers, and since Mr. Yekatom was transferred, he now, as a father, is thousands of kilometers away from his family. Many of them have not been able to visit him, and he is deeply affected by that. Mr. Yekatom's last child was born in December 2018, a few weeks after he was arrested and transferred. I'll show you photographs of that child. So 6 years ago, this child was born. And this also represents the time that Mr. Yekatom has spent in detention. It is only in March 2020 that Mr. Yekatom met his daughter for the first time, who was 1 year old, during a family visit.
Before his arrest, Mr. Yekatom also took care of his mother, to whom he was very close, and he helped his mother both financially and psychologically. She has not been able to see him since his arrest either. I think in order to understand the importance of the relationship between Mr. Yekatom and his mother, I refer you to D290824, who mentioned that taking care of their respective mothers, namely this witness's mother and Mr. Yekatom's mother, was an ongoing topic in their conversations. And I think you can see the statement up on your screen. Ever since Mr. Yekatom was transferred to The Hague, he did all he could to keep in touch with his family and to help them as best he could. But it wasn't easy, given the thousands of kilometers between his country and the limited means of communications. You must remember certain aspects of the Central African Republic and the reality there, particularly when it comes to detainees. First of all, not all family members have a telephone. Furthermore, the telephone network in the Central African Republic is not at all similar to the one that you see here, and it doesn't cover the entire country. I would also like to remind you that Mr. Yekatom's telephone calls were limited and expensive. Organizing family visits funded at the detention center of the ICC depend on voluntary contributions from states parties. There's a special fund that they pay into to allow family visits to occur. There's no specific budget necessarily. Several times, Mr. Yekatom asked for a family visit and he was turned down because this fund was simply empty. Now, Mr. Yekatom realized that it was possible to talk to family members via video link, but as you must realize, that is not at all the same as an actual real-life visit from the family. You can realize just how lonely and sad he was. In a number of days, he was completely rooted, taken out of his family and his community, and these feelings of loneliness and sadness have also had an impact on his family in the Central African Republic. There has been a financial impact on the family as well, because you must realize that Mr. Yekatom was the breadwinner. He was deemed to be indigent by the court, and that over the last 6 years, Mr. Yekatom has done all he could to excessive speed.
Ms. Besa, I'm reminded by the interpreters that you perhaps slow a little bit down. Thank you very much. But actually, you're not the first. Perhaps you will be the last to commit to this small offense, but I have to have, it's better for everyone if you slow a little bit down. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President, and my apologies to the interpreters. Now, at the detention center, I was saying Mr. Yekatom does work, and some of the compensation that he receives covers his food costs. Another part of the fund, of the earnings, goes to telephone calls, and then the rest is sent to his family. He has also been making bracelets, plastic bracelets. They are given to friends as gifts, and now he is making them on a larger scale, and these bracelets are being sold in Bangui. It's another way for him to earn a little bit of money for his family. Your Honors, I would now like to mention a number of mitigating circumstances that we ask you to take into account when the time comes for sentencing. Now, in their briefs and in their remarks yesterday, the prosecutor and the LRV said that there was no mitigating factor that could be taken into account when the sentence is handed down. Yet, Mr. President, Your Honors, the evidence is there. It comes from both defense witnesses and prosecution witnesses. The evidence is there, and the prosecution is not addressing it, and even is saying that there are no mitigating circumstances, and yet the evidence shows a multitude of mitigating factors. We call upon the bench to take into account 4 mitigating factors if a sentence is handed down. First of all, we urge you to take into account the difficult context stemming from the conflict in its entirety. The jurisprudence has already taken such elements into account when a sentence is determined. For example, at the ICTY, the trial chamber did so in the Sebelici case, and I refer you to paragraph 1284 of that ruling, which you can see on the screening. In that particular case, the trial chamber considered that the commission of crimes by one of the accused against Serbian detainees in Bosnia occurred against a backdrop of a difficult environment of armed conflict in its entirety and events that occurred in the town that the accused person originated from. In particular, in that ruling, mention was made of the constant fear of injury or death for himself or his family. Also, the context of the abuse inflicted upon Bosnian Muslims by Serbs. The same reasoning was followed in several cases from the ICTY and the Special Tribunal for Sierra Leone. These can be taken into account when one considers the threat of the Seleka and the threats against the civilian population in the Central African Republic. I would like to take a few moments to describe the difficult context in 2013 and the context that Mr. Yekatom found himself. Unlike what the prosecution said yesterday, Mr. Yekatom was in a difficult situation that he did not choose. This created fear for himself and for his family members. And such was the case in the Selebicici case. Mr. Yekatom worked for Mr. Clemengu. And in 2013, as we heard from witness P8014, and you have this up on the screen, after the Seleka seized power, Mr. Yekatom continued to work at the B3. His commanding officer was no longer Captain Clemengu, but rather Seleka General Abdelkader. Dedicated to his military values, Mr. Yekatom remained at the B3, even though the Seleka had seized power, because as a soldier, it does not matter which government is in place. What is important is to protect the state and the people. Mr. President, Madam, Your Honors, in a moment, I'd like to ask you to consider the chaos and the atrocities that occurred in 2013 because of the Seleka. You have heard countless witnesses talk about this. You have seen the footage. You have seen the photographs. The Seleka engaged in arbitrary arrest. They kidnapped people because they were just unfortunate enough to maybe look at a Seleka element the wrong way. There was summary executions, looting, indiscriminate shooting, rapes, torture, bodies thrown into the river, houses torched, families that no longer had a place to live. The list of acts of abuse and violence is a long list, and the accounts of the witnesses are even longer. The Seleka targeted the FACA, and Mr. Yekatom was not spared. He was targeted by the Seleka 3 times, and we will now play some footage. It will be coming up on the screen. And 2 witnesses have explained that it was only by a stroke of good fortune that Mr. Yekatom was able to get away and cross the river to Zongo. Mr. Yekatom lived in Zongo as an exile. He was forced to go into exile. He had no choice. And life there was difficult. He was imprisoned for several days by the authorities, and as a soldier, he was not eligible to UNHCR protection. Once again, Mr. President, Your Honors, just imagine every day you are in exile and you receive news reports of catastrophic events in your home country. You're afraid that the Seleka will retaliate against your wife, your sister, your family. Your family is scattered because they too have had to scatter.
et vous savez qu'il n'y a plus d'ordre.
You're afraid, and you know that there is no public order, no authority, no protection force, no one to defend your family members. In 2013, and you heard this from several witnesses, the Central African Republic was completely left to its own devices. The humanitarian workers did what they could, but the situation was extremely dangerous. D295013 told you this, and indeed, Mr. Yekatom suffered the reprisals from the Seleka. They completely destroyed his house. Fortunately, no one was living in his house at that moment. So yes, as a member of the FACA and as a father, Mr. Yekatom wanted to fight to save his country, drive out the Seleka and President Jatoja. You have heard abundant evidence in this regard, and I would like to play some video footage for you now, and Mr. Yekatom gives an explanation for what's going on in this footage.
Il s'agit de car OTP.
Car OTP 2065 2348, second 3 to 54, and the transcript is car OTP 2122, line 17 onwards.
Des anciens FACA?
Oui, c'est vrai, partout c'est des FACA, parce que depuis que l'autre là, les Seleka sont rentrés, ils ont chassé des FACA, ils ne veulent pas travailler avec les FACA. Bon, nous on va mieux pour libérer le peuple centrafricain. C'est par rapport à ça que les FACA sont organisés, la révolution des forces armées centrafricaines pour le peuple. Nous on est là pour libérer le peuple.
Apologies from the booth. We have found the passage. Site translation. AYR. Yes, that's true. There are FACA elements everywhere because ever since the Seleka came in, they have driven out the FACA. They don't want to work with the FACA. We can see better to liberate the people of the Central African Republic. And it is in relation to that the FACA have organized the Revolution of Central African Republic Forces for the People. We are here to liberate the people. End of site translation.
Monsieur le Président, Madame, Messieurs les juges.
Mr. President, Your Honors, you must also realize that the military duty to his country was expected of Mr. Yekatom and other soldiers. There was an expectation of the people, and also the minister, who is also up on the screen, made mention of this duty.
Monsieur le Président, Madame, Messieurs les juges.
Mr. President, Your Honors, I will now move on to the second mitigating circumstances, namely the repetitive efforts by Mr. Yekatom to minimize the suffering of victims of the conflict in 2013 and 2014. First of all, we can see these efforts in the orders that Mr. Yekatom gave not to target civilians, and I refer you to paragraphs 326 to 346 of our final brief, and also his reminders to respect international humanitarian law. And once again, we refer you to our final brief in this regard. His efforts to minimize the suffering of victims were also mentioned in a number of speeches gave by Mr. Yekatom to the people. And many people only wanted vengeance, revenge. But Mr. Yekatom said to people, do not attack the Muslims. He wanted to avoid the Muslim people being victimized. And he also reiterated the objective of the RFA-CPP, which was to drive out the Seleka and President Jetoja. You've heard about this during the trial. You've heard about Mr. Yekatom's participation in the meeting at the Mbaiki Cathedral in 2014. This was a meeting where there was a dialogue, and people from the Muslim community were present, from the Christian community, as well as politicians, law enforcement people, and humanitarian workers. Several witnesses have told you that Mr. Yekatom was there representing the FACA, and that he explained that the goal of the movement was to drive out the Seleka and to drive President Jetoja out of power. Several prosecution witnesses told you that Mr. Yekatom, at that meeting, asked a Muslim to begin the closing prayer, and I make reference to P1839, P2041, and P1666. And this last witness, P1666, who was present, even told you that the person who was in charge of the Muslim youth group went and congratulated Mr. Yekatom at the end of the ceremony. The message of peace that he gave in this meeting room was so convincing that he was asked to repeat that message of peace outside the cathedral. He went out and he repeated the message to the people outside. The speech from Mr. Yekatom greatly reassured the Muslim community and non-Muslims. Witness 1666 said that the speech had quite an impact. He even said, if ever he had not said those things, certainly things would have degenerated into a difficult context. Mr. Yekatom's efforts to minimize the suffering of victims also took the form of various initiatives to restore state institutions and reestablish security for the population after the Seleka had wreaked havoc. He did his best to ensure the gendarmes to go back to their stations.
Toujours de la même façon et dans le but de minimiser les souffrances des victimes.
Once again, in the same fashion, in order to minimize the suffering of the victims of the conflict, once the threat of the Seleka had dissipated and once the state had begun to regain power, Mr. Yekatom began the DDR process, as this was described to you by witness D298019. I believe you've seen a number of documents to this effect. I will now move to the third mitigating circumstance that we would like to ask you to take into account at the time of sentencing. I am speaking of Mr. Yekatom's efforts to assist the victims of the crimes charged. Several defense witnesses, but also OTP witnesses, explained how Mr. Yekatom provided assistance to the Muslim population during the events. And I would like to focus particularly on D295014. In this courtroom, you heard how Mr. Yekatom saved her during the events. She told you how a crowd had broken into her compound to attack her and her children in January 2014, and how Mr. Yekatom called out to the crowd and said not to touch her, and also, and I quote, "The Muslims are not our enemies are the Seleka." Mr. Yekatom had no interest in saving D295014. She was not a family member. She was not a friend, but he saved her. The facts are there. They were not challenged, nor by the OTP. And this was not an isolated case. The witness also explained how Mr. Yekatom assisted the people of Boda, the Muslims who had come from Boda, where chaos reigned, so that they could get to Bangui without any problem. And furthermore, an OTP witness, 1193, have told the court how Mr. Yekatom surrendered the Muslims from the Lobai area to the Miska because they were being threatened by the population. He also explained how Mr. Yekatom protected the Muslims at PK9 while the population was trying to attack them. Similarly, P0888 gave testimony saying that Mr. Yekatom was in the village of Bandokoro, close to Bosongoa. A truck halted at a checkpoint. Mr. Yekatom heard noise, and he heard a child crying from the back of the truck, and he discovered that some Muslims were hiding in the truck. Mr. Yekatom had them get out of the truck, and so that they could get some there, and he bought them some water to drink. Then he escorted them to Bangui in his own vehicle. P1647 also told you how Mr. Yekatom sent him to the village of Kapu to protect the Peul people who were in that village. P0446 also gave testimony about Mr. Yekatom being at the gendarmerie close to Central Palm. He spoke of a Muslim man called Koyabade who had to be protected, and how he called upon P0446 to release him. So you must consider all the meetings, the speeches to encourage social cohesion organized by Mr. Yekatom, the meetings he attended, some of which were filmed, others not. Unlike what the OTP has said, Mr. Yekatom's remarks were always the same, whether there were cameras there or not, whether there were journalists there or not, whether there were NGO representatives there or not. And yet the OTP claims there are no mitigating circumstances. Sometimes these efforts to reduce and minimize the suffering of the victims were shown in ordinary conversations that Mr. Yekatom had with Muslim people. You heard this from P2353, a man living in Mbaiki. As he was preparing to leave the Central African Republic for Chad, Mr. Yekatom asked him not to go. He said that soon the situation would stabilize and that he would be able to go back and live in Mbaiki. He told him that he knew what it was like to live in exile. And because he knew that, he asked P2353, who was both a witness and a victim in these proceedings, not to leave. This conversation illustrates that Mr. Yekatom never wanted the Muslims to leave. In addition to directly protecting Muslim victims, Mr. Yekatom took part and initiated a number of activities with a view to enhancing social cohesion. This was also a way to help the victims of the crisis. One example was the reopening of the mosques after the events. Witness D293010 and prominent figure in the Muslim community in Bangui told you about Mr. Yekatom speaking at the Fatima Church, calling for the Kina Mosque to be reopened. He also spoke to the neighborhood chief because the Muslim people required a place to worship. He also asked for the Muslim cemetery to reopen, and we have gone into greater detail about this in our closing brief, paragraph 46. I'll now move on to the last mitigating circumstance, namely Mr. Yekatom's efforts to enhance social cohesion and to bring about peace and reconciliation. D293010 has told the court about Mr. Yekatom taking part in a meeting for peace at the MINUSCA. He also made mention of a ceremony, and he mentioned that Mr. Yekatom was the only person who responded to the call to take part in this meeting for reconciliation. Mr. Yekatom took part in the meetings in Brazzaville, the Brazzaville Forum, with a number of representatives from civil society and the Central African Youth Movement, a forum that was organized to guarantee the cessation of hostilities. And he was just not a mere participant. As soon as he returned to the Central African Republic, Mr. Yekatom went directly to the population to raise their awareness of reconciliation. A year later, Mr. Yekatom took part in the Bangui Forum in 2015. Witnesses D293010 and P8019 have told you about this. P8019 told you about this. D293010 also told the court what Mr. Yekatom said, quote, "We are here for peace in the country. Everything we have done has been in order to fight the Seleka, but you must not hurt the civilian population." The OTP say that there was no mitigating circumstances. Despite what Mr. Yekatom said, Mr. Yekatom also organized some sporting events. D298017 told you about this. And he mentioned a football game that was organized between young Muslim people and Christians. I mentioned the Saibado football pitch. This is a place where Mr. Yekatom actually played football when he was a child. And you see, football is a activity that is very popular in the Central African Republic. The entire community can join in. As I said earlier, Mr. Yekatom went on to become the Member of Parliament representing Mbaiki, and during his campaigning, he continued his efforts to restore peace and to enhance social cohesion. And this patriotic duty that I've mentioned earlier became a desire to serve his country and the people of the Central African Republic. As a Member of Parliament, Mr. Yekatom took his mandate very seriously, as we heard from D298027 and D298019. He regularly traveled to his electoral district so that he could stay close to his constituents. He was very much aware of the day-to-day problems in his district. I think you will agree that the two pillars of society are education and health. Mr. Yekatom focused on those two themes during his time as a Member of Parliament. We have heard this from D298017 and D298019. He had a number of projects, for example, to build a school in Kapu and a health center in Bosongo. Mr. Yekatom continued the struggle that he had begun as a soldier against nepotism and he called for a more professional army. During his mandate, Mr. Yekatom also spoke out against the corruption of other members of parliament. What is more, Mr. Yekatom refused to be part of the corruption. He turned down a large amount of money, and he voted for the stepping down of the former Muslim Speaker of the National Assembly. This is what D298027 told you at paragraph 23 of his statement, and I quote, Mr. Yekatom refused to yield to the pressure of the government of the day. Yesterday, the OTP showed you some video footage of the incident at the National Assembly without giving you any background. This footage came at the very moment when the vote had been called to turn out Karim Mekwassa by the members of parliament who had been bribed by the government of the day. So I think it's important to see that incident in context. Unlike what you heard in the video, Mr. Yekatom did not fire at anyone on that day. To be perfectly honest, Mr. President, Your Honors, I don't have enough time to be truly comprehensive in my remarks and to set out each and every piece of evidence, each and every word that you have heard from the witnesses about the efforts to bring about reconciliation and peace, words uttered by Mr. Yekatom in his speeches. Once again, the OTP says there are no mitigating circumstances. Thank you very much for listening, Mr. President, Your Honor, and I'll now turn over to my colleague, Mr. Page-Grenier.
Thank you, Ms. Bessa.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, Your Honors, Ms. Bessa has introduced you to Mr. Yekatom. She has told you who he is, his family history, his professional career. She has also told you about the mitigating circumstances that you can take into account in determining a possible sentence. I would like, first of all, to remain on this topic and show you contemporaneous videos relating to the facts, illustrating that at the time, Mr. Yekatom's attitude was one that tended to protect the population. This will enable you to better appreciate who Mr. Yekatom really is, an individual quite different from the portrait that has been projected to you by the prosecutor, who yesterday pleaded as follows.
Defense suggestion that Mr. Yekatom worked towards the promotion of peace, in view of the facts provided in this case, is an astonishing claim. Alors voyons la preuve au
Now let us look at the evidence on file. I would like, first of all, to show you a first video recorded around 13 December 2013 in Boeing, in Bangui, during the heart of the events, in which you see Mr. Yekatom in contact with the population, trying to reassure them. The video lasts 25 seconds, and for the interpreters, translation is at CAR OTP 21274438, lines 5 to 23. And for your information, the video can be displayed to the public.
Alanga kotola bambenizo so alindaga kenjonizo pala sianle rapidement na mongi so ajigezo itenga comment il peut récupérer là Mais la dia kango beton da pasa ba ina kunyu jande. Izi posogi. Paysan de menika do kala sambe to fa. Ala bate leti to alo kati gasin beni ya da rapidement la.
Merci.
Monsieur le Président, je ne sais pas si vous avez une traduction.
Mr. President, I don't know if you followed the English translation of this video, but the interpreters could not locate it quickly enough, Mr. President.
That's no problem. I think when you found it, please let us know, and please read it out then, and then we signal to Council that he can continue.
The message from the interpreters: could Council repeat the ERN number?
Could you please repeat the ERN number?
So the video is CAR 2065-1989, and the translation is CAR OTP 2127-4438, line 5 to 23.
We have it now, Mr. President. If we remain free, then the other elements cannot go back. We shall set up a guard post in order to protect you. Very well. Yes, yes. You also, you have persons coming in. If they're not doing well, let us know quickly to the youth. In fact, so that we can know how to recover. But please do not be afraid. If God wishes, all will end up well. Very well. I will put in place a post here. Very well. Well, then we will open another one there. So please don't be afraid. Thank you. You are like our eyes. Whenever you see them coming, then there is something happening. Quickly, please. Code, yes, yes, I understand.
Thank you very much. Please continue.
Dans cette vidéo, vous avez vu.
In that video, you saw and you heard Mr. Yekatom talking to the inhabitant in Boeing neighborhood saying, do not be afraid. We will set up a post here to protect you. Do not be afraid. Those were his words. And in the case file, there are several other videos of this nature. And we have identified some of them in the table motion of the prosecutor. So I refer you to Annex A 2233. And these videos reflect Mr. Yekatom's intention to provide security and protection for all inhabitants wherever they were, without any distinction and without discrimination. Beyond the protection of the population, as we have just seen, Mr. Yekatom was also concerned about protecting property belonging to the state. And you have another video on your screen which was recorded near Bangui around 13 December 2013. It lasts 1 minute 13 seconds, and for the interpreters, translation is at EAR-OTP 00002083 from lines 1 to 26.
Please let us know when you're ready, and then we can play it. So we have a sort of simultaneous interpretation here.
We are ready, Mr. President.
Okay, then it can be played.
Stop him. Where are the people? You all who were there, come. Please don't run away. Don't try to save yourselves. Come, 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 you all. Go over there. Behind there. Behind those who are here. Well, come. Please don't run away. Why are the children running away? And then there's my mother. Tell the children to come. Where are the others? The fox. They are here. Where did they go? I don't know where they went. They're absent. And you over there, come. You have come to steal again? Well, the thing is, these things, children were stealing. And so I saw it, and I came to tell that I'm going to take the cover of the toilet, Papa. Well, look at me. A mother. The other persons who were with you, where are they?
Thanks a lot. I think that was enough. Yeah. You may proceed.
Dans cette vidéo, vous venez de voir monsieur.
In that video, you see Mr. Yekatom come into a compound in an industrial zone belonging to the state, and you can understand from the video that this area was being looted. You heard his interaction with a lady, a mother involved in looting in such an area. You heard him wonder where the fox were. Now, the fox in the Central African Republic is a term for security guards. So he was asking, where are the official guards who are supposed to provide security in that area? Then there is another video which was recorded shortly thereafter, which would not be displayed, and its references you can see on the screen. On this video, you can see Mr. Yekatom organizing the persons present in order to provide security during the pillaging until things got resolved. This video indicates that Mr. Yekatom also cared about protecting state property, and he knew that plundering state property would end up costing the population. You can see from these videos that he spontaneously spoke to people in Sango and was not mindful of the cameras. He wasn't staging a show for the journalist who was filming. Yesterday, the prosecutor told you that the person you have seen in this courtroom is not the same person who was on the ground in 2014. These images actually show you who he is, who he was. Someone who was concerned about reassuring the population in matters of security wherever they were, so that they could live under as well as they could under these circumstances. So when it comes to sentencing, please bear these images in mind and take them into account, because in 2013-2014, Mr. Yekatom was also the man whom you have seen on these images. Mr. President, Your Honors, let me now deal with the issues pertaining to the facts charged, particularly some of the charges against him. This will complete our written submissions and also somehow react to the submissions by the prosecutor. We want upfront to be very clear on one point. There is no additional aggravating circumstances pertaining to the charges against Mr. Yekatom. What I'm saying here is that all the facts identified by the prosecutor and the legal representatives of victims are either already included in the assessment of the gravity of the sentence or have not been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. In the next few minutes, I am not going to address each of the arguments, but I would rather engage in trying to provide you with information around the circumstances pertaining to the charges, contrary to the prosecutor who focused on the participation of Mr. Yekatom. The first issue is in relation to the temporal circumstances of the charges. It is important to note that the temporal framework is significantly reduced because the acts charged mostly fall within a period of 3 months, early 2013 and end of February 2014. So in the assessment of a possible sentence, you must take into account this time frame, namely that these events occurred within a very short space of time and quite quickly. This period, which is quite limited as it pertains to the charges, can be explained by the fact that Mr. Yekatom's objective, at least to his mind, was very clear, namely for Mr. Jotodia and Seleka to leave power because their regime had committed significant exactions on the population, and this has already been made very clear to you. Once the objective of getting Mr. Jotodia out of power had been reached, Mr. Yekatom then begins immediately to engage in reconciliation work. You can remember the video on which you see him in the company of Seleka Suleiman Dauda, whom he calls his brother, a few days after he had been shot at. Some of the stakeholders in the conflict may have had hidden objectives, but that was not the case for Mr. Yekatom. He was not an overzealous soldier working for a political party or an ideology. He did not fight for the return of a political personality to power. He fought because he wanted Mr. Jotodia and the Seleka out, and that was it, no more, no less. So that is how Mr. Yekatom was involved in the conflict, and this should be taken into account for sentencing. Let me now talk about charges relating to the operation on 5 December in 2013 to Bangui. Yes, you have understood that indeed Mr. Yekatom participated in that operation. Yes, he was involved in the fighting on that day, Your Honors. But in your determination, you must find whether the acts that are punishable by this court were committed during that operation. It is important, Your Honors, to recall that he participated in this operation after communication with Captain Gremangu, his former military leader. And I refer you to paragraph 355 of our final brief. The case file does not show that Mr. Yekatom participating in determining the date of the attack and the choice of actors, or even in the decision to attack Bangui in general. This absence in the decision-making and the planning of the attack in general should also be taken into account.
Toujours, en fait, et le but de mon propos, vous l'aurez...
You would have understood, Your Honors, that I am seeking here to demonstrate that Mr. Yekatom was not an architect or a main contributor to the thinking in relation to the attack of the 5th of December. The prosecutor argues that there is an aggravating circumstance pertaining to the vulnerability of traders who were killed at the Boeing market. For such a circumstance to be valid, it must be established between a reasonable doubt. And in this case, the prosecutor failed to meet that honors. He has navigated in an area of uncertainty and does not see why these people were vulnerable, and therefore the threshold of a reasonable doubt has not been met. The prosecutor also deforms the evidence by suggesting to you yesterday, as they did in their brief, that the simple fact that someone interacted with the Seleka was enough reason for that person to be killed. That has never been the defense position, and that is not the evidence that you have heard relating to the traders at the Boy market. The evidence on file shows that one or several traders had weapons, then they had uniforms, had ranks that had been attributed by the Seleka, and that they were involved in the fighting that morning on the 5th of December. And this evidence comes from the prosecutor's witnesses themselves. P0884, for example, and I refer you to paragraph 394 of their final brief and follows. So that context does not reflect vulnerable citizens as projected by the prosecutor, and therefore, Your Honors, you should reject that request for aggravating circumstances. As you can now see on the screen, the prosecutor in paragraph 22 of its brief referred to the participation of Mr. Yekatom in the crimes prosecuted is great, and as I quote in English,
in their commission. Il vous appartiendra dans votre jugement.
It will be up to you in your judgment to analyze the real degree of involvement of Mr. Yekatom in the crimes committed. We therefore want to remind you that the evidence on file shows that Mr. Yekatom was not present during a substantial part of the events of 24 December 2013 and the death of Mr. Sensir Lapo. The evidence is clear, and the prosecutor himself refers to that at paragraphs 696 and 697 of his closing brief. I refer you also to paragraphs 445 and subsequent of our closing submission on this point. Similarly, when it comes to the charges relating to the PK9 Bike axis, we must remember that the evidence on file tends to show that Mr. Yekatom was not present during the fighting on that axis. Witness P1839 is clear and consistent on this point, as you can see on the screen. Another witness, P1666, also said that Mr. Yekatom was rarely seen in Baiki and that he simply only patrolled the axis from time to time. Baiki precisely is the place at which the second deputy mayor, Mr. Jido Saleh, was murdered. From the evidence, therefore, it appears that Mr. Yekatom was not present during that murder, and there is nothing to lead to the conclusion that there was a specific order issued by him in relation to that murder. Now, contrary to the prosecutor's submissions, you must take this into account as well, namely that he was not physically present when these acts occurred, and therefore this absence greatly impacts his degree of participation in the accomplishment of the charges. And this is necessarily something you must take into account as a diminishing factor. Let me now, for a few minutes, address you on the charges relating to 24 December 2013 in Yamrawa, particularly on the degree of seriousness of such facts. Count 14, imprisonment and other forms of serious deprivation of physical liberty. In this regard, it is necessary to take into account the circumstances of the short duration of the event as a whole. You see, people were taken and brought to the Yamra base in the afternoon of 24 December 2013 and would be taken to the Sylvester Yaguzu base in the evening. They spent only a few hours at the Yamrawa base, and then from Mr. Yaguzu's base they were handed over to the French forces 48 hours after on the 26th of December. So we need to take that short duration into account. Similarly, there was an absence of serious physical injury, and this has to be taken into account in sentencing. Mrs. Catherine Samba Panza mentioned this on radio at the time when she said that the people were not mistreated. But what is even more important, the testimony of P1811 that you see on screen must be taken into account, because he testified that they were released, and when asked whether they had been beaten or mistreated, his answer was in the negative. Now, when we turn to Mr. Yekatom's behavior upon arriving at the base that evening, this should also be taken into account. P1811 clearly indicates that when Mr. Yekatom arrived, he spoke calmly with us and he did not hurt anyone or abuse anyone. In fact, on the contrary, Mr. Yekatom immediately contacted Sangaris forces, and you have that information on the call register. The people were transferred the same evening to Mr. Yaguzu's base, from where they were effectively handed over to the Sangaris forces. Mr. Yekatom's immediate intervention for the release of the victims should be a mitigating circumstance in relation to the charges pertaining to the 24 December 2013 event. Furthermore, you must take into account that when Mr. Yekatom arrived, he reassured the remaining group, telling them that no evil would befall them. And you can see that on your screen. To conclude on this point, we can understand from the evidence that Mr. Yekatom seems to have discovered personal links with one of the persons in the group. But in spite of that, we must point out that Mr. Yekatom assisted all the persons, all of them, those he knew and those he did not know when he arrived at the base. This, we argue, should support a mitigated sentence in this regard.
I have the impression that this would be a good time to have this very, very short break of 5 minutes that we announced. Dimitri?
Mr. President, if I may suggest, Mr. Pages-Cranier is almost done, just a few minutes left. And
that's
my last part is half an hour, so it would be for us the natural break, if that's okay with your honors.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is a good explanation. Thank you. So please continue.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs.
Mr. President, Your Honors, let me now tackle my last topic. Who is Mr. Yekatom today, January 2025? Who is this man whom you have on trial? Now, when it comes to determining sentencing, you are required by the rules to identify the person you are sentencing, determine his personality. Mr. Yekatom was transferred from the Central African Republic to the detention center on November 17, 2018, 6 years ago, thousands of kilometers away from his home to a country he does not know. He doesn't know their language. This transfer is a very brutal removal from his environment. The man today is about 50 years old, and he would have spent at least 1/5 of his life in provisional detention. His behavior while in detention can enable you to assess his personality today. We must all recognize that the pre-trial detention was anything but normal, first of all, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. This crisis led to a total interruption of family visits for 16 months, almost a year and a half. A total interruption of defense visits to Mr. Yekatom for 10 months, practically a year. From March 2020 to early 2021, Mr. Yekatom's only social ties were the guards and other inmates, and this led to an extreme isolation of Mr. Yekatom, much more than what is expected of a normal detention. This isolation could simply have been mitigated by the implementation of simple measures to allow at least visual contact between Mr. Yekatom and his relatives. This is possible, and other tribunals have done so, as you can see on the screen. The tribunals were pragmatic to the extent that if physical visits were no longer possible, then at least they should be allowed to see their families on videos. Unfortunately, the registry of the International Criminal Court was not that proactive. As you can see, it was only after your decision 869 that the registry finally allowed these video calls from March 2021, several months after other international criminal tribunals had done so, and which, by the way, happened to share the same facilities at the detention center in The Hague. There is no justification for these delays which have contributed to exacerbating Mr. Yekatom's isolation. He could have had telephone calls. His telephone calls were restricted and he had only 1 or 2 calls per week. During that period, there was an uncertainty about the evolution of the pandemic and the isolation of Mr. Yekatom and the difficulties having contact with his family, particularly his mother who was unwell and in the Central African Republic. All of these had effects, aggravating effects on Mr. Yekatom because of his detention. Article 78.2 of the Rome Statute provides that time spent in pre-trial detention is subtracted from the prison sentence imposed. This article, I believe, was written on the premise that the detention conditions of the detainee would be normal. No one at the time imagined that there would be a world pandemic that would deteriorate and aggravate such conditions, impacting their detention to that extent. Therefore, Mr. Yekatom's detention had a much more severe effect on him than what would normally be envisaged or than what other detainees of this court have experienced. We therefore ask you to take into account that the part of his detention was much harsher than it should have been in normal times. In this regard, several domestic jurisdictions took into account the effects of this health crisis with regard to sentences imposed. In the United Kingdom, COVID-19 was considered to have made an impact on detention. The French and Canadian jurisdiction, for example, considered that the pretrial detention is inherently difficult and harsh on detainees, and that the health crisis has only reinforced this harshness. And this also you must take into account in determining sentencing. We therefore also ask you to take into account these very abnormally harsh circumstances of detention when you calculate Mr. Yekatom's sentence. As I mentioned earlier, for a 10-month period, the defense was unable to meet Mr. Yekatom physically at the detention. This happened at a critical time in the trial, and at that time, the defense was supposed to be analyzing the hundreds and thousands of materials in evidence. It was difficult for us to see him at the detention center, whereas we could go sit with him at other times and watch videos together. But during the pandemic, we had to work from home, each one in their home through telephones and what have you. So it took a lot more time, a lot more resources for the team to proceed to this kind of meaningful analysis. But despite this, and this is important to note, Mr. Yekatom never wanted to ask for postponement of the start of the trial because he wanted, and he did actually do everything to ensure that the trial would start on time. He kept this line, he held this position, namely not to delay proceedings. And you would remember that even when he had health problems, he accepted or he agreed to proceed with trial through video conference from the prison. Sometimes even renouncing his own very right to be present. This is because he understood the consequences of the postponement of a hearing. And so out of respect for the court and of respect for the witnesses who had come from far away particularly out of respect for the work that the court is doing. This, I believe, Mr. President, points to Mr. Yekatom's good conduct with the court and has nothing to do with what the prosecutor has accused. Another problem, quickly, which Mr. Yekatom faced at the detention center was the failure to respect his rights. As you can see, you have the standard 199 on the screen pertaining to food served at the detention center. This standard requests that, or this rule requires that the practice should uphold the circumstances of an inmate. Now, since Mr. Yekatom arrived at the detention center, Rule 199 has not been respected. But in spite of it, he followed the rules, he followed the procedures, made a submission, and filed a complaint which went all the way to the presidency in February 2023. So the presidency, as you can see on the screen, has ruled in favor of Mr. Yekatom, directing the registry to rectify the situation. But since then, what has happened? Nothing. Nothing has happened. The registry merely sends vague memoranda indicating that they are working on the problem. There is no date for compliance set. And what is the consequence? Mr. Yekatom is still waiting. This example, Your Honors, points to a better assessment of the personality and behavior of Mr. Yekatom today, which is a far cry from what the prosecutor would have you believe. In spite of the administrative problems with the detention center, Mr. Yekatom is able to have reasonable judgment. When he was down with COVID, the first thing that he did was to send a letter of appreciation to the guards and to the hospital staff. This is who Mr. Yekatom is. This behavior is not isolated. Mr. Yekatom is someone who was prepared to help fellow inmates by preparing food. He played the role of a mediator when there were tensions between detainees. And this is a far cry from the image portrayed by the prosecution of a detainee who violates the rules of his conditions of detention. Particularly, I want to point you to the various submissions we have made on the issue of violation of telephone restrictions. And I remind you that Mr. Yekatom was proactive in reminding his interlocutors of the applicable rules. Mr. President, Your Honors, what can we learn from all this? All the elements that I have mentioned point only to one direction, namely the fact that Mr. Yekatom qualifies on all counts to be reintegrated into society if you were to pronounce a sentence, a factor that you have to take into account. Mr. Yekatom will be 50 years at the end of this month. His military and political careers as Mr. Yekatom are behind him. His only project is to be there for his family and to help them. This is who Mr. Yekatom is today in January 25. And I thank you, Mr. President, Your Honors. Thank you for your kind attention. I'll give the floor to Ms. Dimitri after the break. Thank you.
Indeed, after the break, which will be really short, 5 minutes, and please let us know when we can continue then. Thank you.
All rise, veuillez vous lever.